Hey guys, it's Leah B from Prestige Veteran Medical Consulting. I'm a U.S. Army veteran, physician assistant, and former compensation examiner. So I have Rebecca Deming on today from ProVet Legal. We have had her on a few times in the past, and we are doing our second segment on DIC benefits, a deeper dive into DIC benefits. But before we get started, Rebecca, can you tell us a little bit about what DIC benefits are again, for those that maybe didn't watch the first?
Yeah, DIC is Dependency and Indemnity Compensation, and it's basically a bucket of benefits that's available if you're the surviving spouse, child, or parent of a member who died in the line of duty or a survivor of a veteran who died from a service-related injury or illness, or if the veteran was 100% for a certain period of time. And it's we talked about this last time we chatted, but it's not all children, and there's certain requirements for age or whether the child's disabled, and parents. It's really only if there's an income issue where they're living below the poverty line, and for spouses they have to have been married for a year. So there are certain eligibility requirements even within that. But yeah, survivors get a monthly compensation if they qualify for DIC.
Sure. And for those of you who did not watch that initial video, I would recommend that you go back and check that out so you can get spun up a little bit more on the basics of who is eligible and what some of those eligibility requirements are, because we go into great detail on that. And again, Rebecca is an accredited VA attorney representing claimants not only on just general VA benefits, but their surviving dependents on this type of benefit as well worldwide, mostly in the US, but for veterans that are overseas as well. So regarding DIC benefits, let's talk about a death certificate. So what if a veteran's death certificate just says natural causes, or is sort of non-specific?
That's a great question. We get that a lot. I think a lot of times if they died at home and it was just natural causes, the doctors aren't going to get into a lot of nuances to what the cause of death was. They rule out murder, they rule out suicide, and then it's just natural causes. Even you might even see something like that, or see something kind of generic at a hospital. And sometimes I think doctors will do that too, because there's a lot of factors that contribute to death. It might help them a little bit with protecting against medical malpractice. I know they've got their legal staff at the hospitals that dictate what they're allowed to put on death certificates and whatnot. So sometimes, we have to show that the death was, that the service-connected condition or that an event in service materially contributed to the cause of death. So the cause of death listed on the death certificate doesn't have to line up one-to-one with their service-connected disabilities. So there's a few things we can do. In some situations, you can try to talk to the coroner's office and see if you can get the death certificate amended. If it's something simple, like they died of a stroke, and they had, and it would be really helpful if the death certificate reflected that they died of a stroke because the veteran had coronary artery conditions that would have led to a stroke. That's going to be really helpful. And in some circumstances, either the family physician can coordinate with the coroner's office to get that changed. If they died in the hospital, they might be able to do that. I know I've talked to some doctors, and they've told me that because of the fear of litigation, hospitals are always worried about medical malpractice, especially if they get lawyers involved. Requests to change a death certificate are often met with resistance. So that we can try that. Sometimes we're successful. I have been successful occasionally with getting the death certificates amended, and that's really helpful. Otherwise, we want to kind of get the medical records, statements from the family members. If they were treating regularly for a heart condition, we might need to get a Nexus letter that says this is at least as likely as not what the cause of death was. The veteran was found deceased in the house.
Sure.
It's at least as likely as not. So sometimes we're back engineering what the likely cause of death was.
Sure.
By looking at their medical records, talking with their doctors, talking with family members to kind of reconstruct what their symptoms were leading to the death.
That makes a lot of sense. And I know we're going to get into a couple of examples here shortly, but you mentioned materially contributed. Can you tell me a little bit more about what you mean by, so obviously a cause of death would be, if the veteran, it was a direct cause, right? I'm having trouble thinking of an example of that at the moment, but tell me what materially contributed means.
Sure. Yeah. Like, so for a direct cause, like,
Cancer.
If they were service connected for cancer and their death certificate says they died from that kind of cancer, like that's an easy one. You've got that. You don't need a medical opinion because that's already materially contributed. So if the cause of death is not listed as the service connected condition, VA's internal regulations instruct the examiner or the rating officer to look at. They instruct the rating officer to ask the examiner to give an opinion on whether the service-connected condition contributed substantially or materially to the veteran's death.
Mm-hmm.
So contributed substantially or materially to the veteran's death, combined to cause death, and that's an interesting one that that I know we'll dig into, or aided or lent assistance to the production of death. It is not sufficient to show that it casually shared in producing death, but rather it must be shown that it was a causal connection.
Sure.
So it really has to have impacted them. It might be, but for this condition, they wouldn't have died, or this service connected condition made it so they weren't able to recover from the non-service connected condition.
So let's get into some of these types, because I get a lot of questions about when DIC applies. I have a lot of veterans that ask these types of questions. I know I ask you a million questions about it too, because it's a very complex topic. So let's get into some of these types. So what if somebody's death certificate, for example, says that they passed away of pneumonia? What are some of the things, ultimately this person was sick, they got hospitalized, they had pneumonia. What are some of the things that you would dissect or pull apart to look at how that may apply to a veteran?
So I would certainly look at whether it was kind of a primary pneumonia, like did they go to the hospital because they had pneumonia? And if that's the case, I'd look at what risk factor, were they service connected for any respiratory conditions? Were they, pneumonia is often a condition that develops while you're in the hospital because you've got weakened immune systems, or you're exposed to hospital germs and whatnot. And so then I'd look at what sent the veteran to the hospital if they developed pneumonia while they were there. I also, if it's a Vietnam vet, or really any vet, but especially Vietnam vets, because Parkinson's disease is presumptively connected to Agent Orange. If they died of pneumonia, I'll ask I'll look through the records to see if they had Parkinson's disease, because Parkinson's disease causes issues with control of muscles, and it can cause issues with swallowing. And if you're aspirating when you're swallowing your food, that leads to pneumonia a lot. So actually, like the number one, I think I might have learned it from you, the number one cause of death for people with advanced Parkinson's disease is pneumonia. So we're sort of looking at what caused the pneumonia to see if they were service connected. We're also looking at if they had any conditions that, if they developed pneumonia independent from service connected conditions, were there any conditions they had that, a healthy person would have been able to recover, but because they had hypertension or because they had service connected asthma, the pneumonia became fatal.
Yeah, like if they're a Gulf War veteran, I'm pretty sure COPD is now, after PACT Act, right? COPD is one of those presumptive conditions. So if they had pneumonia and their COPD complicated their clinical picture, that can certainly be a material contribution, right?
Yep.
Which leads me into the big one, which I've seen quite a few cases for. I know you and I both worked on one together, which is COVID, right? So COVID was very prevalent over the past few years. Talk to me a little bit about what you have seen with COVID-related death, DIC, and material contribution from service-related disabilities.
So there's actually internal guidance. So VA follows their internal manual, like when the rating officer is looking at a file, and they have specific instructions. If the cause of death is stated as COVID, And we all know that a lot of deaths were listed as COVID. More death certificates said COVID than natural causes when COVID pandemic was at its height. I don't know number wise, but that was a common reason that was listed on the death certificate. So if that's the cause of death that's listed, then the rating officer is instructed to obtain a medical opinion on the cause of death that asks whether COVID-19 is listed as a primary or contributory cause of death, and the veteran was service connected for one of the conditions listed by the CDC, the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, that are more likely to lead to severe illness from COVID-19. Yeah. So we've got that list, and so we've, we can pull up that list, but I think it covers obviously respiratory conditions, hypertension, but there's other ones that are like chronic kidney disease, cancers, and there's even mental health conditions that have, if you've got depression, you're more likely to have lethal COVID or more serious complications from COVID. I know the science is still kind of figuring out why that is, if it's because people with depression are less likely to go get treatment, or if it actually is some chemical change in the brain that makes them more susceptible to complications from COVID. But if one of the service-connected conditions is listed on the CDC list, then they're supposed to give special consideration in the opinion about whether that condition materially contributed to the cause of death.
Yeah, and I'm sure it can be conditional or conditions, because sometimes there are multiple risk factors that are listed on the CDC's website that, and not just for COVID, but for other conditions. Maybe the veteran has 2 or 3 different medical conditions that contribute. And that, in my opinion, from a medical perspective, makes the case even stronger, medically speaking, because they've got so many comorbidities that can increase that risk. So we talked about pneumonia, we talked about COVID. Can you tell me a little bit about, and this is going to be one that is sort of a tough topic to talk about, but one that I've actually seen quite a bit about, suicide. What are some of the things that you've seen about veteran suicide and DIC cases?
Yeah. So again, it kind of comes back to whether a service-connected condition materially contributed to the cause of death. And so VA actually looks at a little bit more nuanced than we would think if the veteran is service-connected for PTSD, and then they commit suicide, that should be a slam dunk case. I would say it's a very strong case, but VA is actually going to look into and request a medical opinion on whether the PTSD materially contributed to their decision to commit suicide, or whether it was something else. So the veteran might, I guess the outlier cases that VA is trying to rule out by asking for that opinion is if the veteran had PTSD but was making a rational decision because they have a non-service connected terminal illness, and or something completely unrelated to their PTSD caused them to become suicidal. I think it's pretty rare if you have PTSD and then become suicidal, for someone to be able to disentangle that and say, well, no, they committed suicide for another reason, is going to be challenging for VA. I've seen them do it. We've fought it. We've won. But that's one of the questions that they're looking at. So to kind of take it a step further in this same realm, let's talk about, and I know this is going to be a tough topic for some people that have had this experience with one of their family members, but let's talk about murder, right? Or homicide, death by homicide. Have you seen cases where homicide has played a role, and you were able to sort of show a relationship for a DIC case? Yes. So, and I'll kind of take it back a step, because we're talking about materially contributed. So a lot of times with PTSD and other mental health disorders, we're able to show that impacted their decision making, and it's a behavioral health issue, right? So because it's behavioral health, we expect there to be behavioral changes. And are they making behavioral decisions or taking actions that are putting them more at risk. So the cases that we've seen with homicide, it was because the veteran was murdered, but because we were able to show that their actions put them in more risk than a person without their mental disabilities would have put themselves in. I know I've heard cases, I think you might have worked on one where the spouse murdered the veteran, but or didn't murder the veteran, killed the veteran.
Yes.
In self-defense, but it was in self-defense because of the veteran's PTSD. And normally if the spouse murders the veteran, I mean, this is getting really touchy. If the spouse murders the veteran, is convicted of murder, that is a bar to benefits. You're not going to murder a veteran and then get benefits. But if the surviving spouse was put in a position where they needed to use lethal force to protect their life or the life of their children, I know in at least one circumstance, they've been granted benefits. But yeah, more often than not, we see it's risk-taking behavior where veterans are driving impaired because they have PTSD with alcohol abuse disorder, and they're speeding or they're closing their eyes on the highway, or that's, kind of like Russian roulette type behavior, and we're able to get that connected back.
Or like maybe a drug overdose too, if that's one of the compensatory behaviors that the veteran is using illicit substance. And this isn't going to be an all or nothing situation, but if a veteran has known, habitually uses dangerous drugs, right, illegal drugs, and it's part of their disability, not just because they're out doing it for fun, but it's a coping mechanism, etc. That could be considered as well, I'm sure, correct?
Yes.
We touched on those. So let's really quickly, one more, because again, let's touch on that cardiac arrest, because cardiac arrest is going to be one of those most commonly listed things on a death certificate, simply because we think we talked about this in our last video. That's just one of those catch-all types of things that someone may put on a death certificate, because when everyone passes away, they have a cardiac arrest, right? Their heart stops beating. So can you provide some, not to regurgitate it over again, but just reinforce what you've already sort of said about those material contributions to a cardiac arrest case?
Yeah. So there's definitely some common ones. And a lot of times if it's kind of funny, I'll reach out to you, Leah, for a medical opinion, or, send you stuff, or send it to a cardiac specialist. If it's something outside, I know a lot of them you're able to give the opinion on.
Sure.
And if it's something beyond your expertise, we'll get another opinion. But
or the family doctor or whoever can help.
Yeah, if it's their treating doctor, sometimes they're able to provide an opinion. But yeah, with cardiac arrest, we're really looking at what led up to that. And so obviously the first step back from cardiac arrest is any kind of ischemic heart disease or hypertension, or what made the heart stop. And so we're looking at the atrial fibrillation, if it's something, what put them at risk for having their heart stop. And so sometimes I know there's a lot of medical literature out there that even people in the medical field haven't read all of it, because there's so much out there. So sometimes we'll get some wonky things. We'll have to ask our medical experts to look into it and see, hey, is this something that could be connected? And sometimes we do have to tell them, hey, it sounds like it was just totally unrelated. But a lot of times, because the body is so interrelated, one system starts to fail and it impacts another system.
Sure. Well, okay. I think that pretty much covers some of those digging deeper topics that we were going to discuss today. Thank you so much for joining us today. Veterans, if you have any questions, please drop them in the comments. If you have other topics you would like to see Rebecca or I discuss, we're happy to take a look at those. Also, if you would like to get in touch with Rebecca, I'm going to put some information on her about her website in the details below. But let me pull up her website real quick so you guys can see it as well, and head on over there. So here is her website. She represents veterans in all 50 states and worldwide for those veterans living overseas on VA disability claims, also these DIC type cases. Rebecca, do you have any other feedback that you'd like to share? Or?
No, I'll just close with the same thing that we wrapped up the last DIC discussion about. And it's a hard topic. I know nobody wants to think about end of life issues, but obviously if you're dealing with a tragedy and a loss of a loved one, it's important to know that these resources are out there. But it's also important from a planning perspective to know that kind of how the system works and know what your loved ones might be entitled to if you predecease them. So it's a morbid conversation, but it's just sort of like getting your will done. It's good financial planning to look into this stuff and kind of understand what benefits your surviving dependents might be entitled to.
Sure thing. Well, thank you again for being here. Veterans, please go check out that first video if you haven't seen it yet. That can provide some more insight and detail onto the basics. And Rebecca, as always, thank you for joining us, and we will see you guys soon. Thanks again.
Thanks, Leah. Bye, guys.